Our scripture reading today comes from John 18:1 through 18. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciple across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often went there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside of the door. So the people and the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of the man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also with them, standing and warming himself. This is the word of the God. Be seated.
Well, thank you guys for taking that survey. If you have a paper copy and you did not get a chance to finish that yet, if at any time you're bored in the next 25 minutes, you can go ahead and do that. But if you do have a paper copy still and you weren't able to return it yet, you can just drop it off at the hello wall after the service, and we'll take it from you there. So, yeah, one of the things I've always loved about Christ Community is this heart that we have to connect faith and work. And many of you know that before I became a pastor, I actually spent about a decade working in healthcare IT. And then I helped pay for seminary. I continued in that space. I worked for a consulting company and did some work there. And I always really enjoyed the work, and I felt it was meaningful because I knew that even though I was a behind-the-scenes kind of person, I knew that my work was helping doctors and nurses and pharmacists and therapists do this really important work of taking care of people, and so I always enjoyed that. And I actually got pretty good at what I did, but it wasn't always that way. One particular story stands out from my early days at this company I worked for. It was a software vendor, and I was in a technical support role, and I worked with a customer who was a prestigious health organization on the East Coast. And I was following up on a question that they asked me, and I sent them some documentation that I thought answered their question. And it was kind of some setup they needed to do in their system that I was telling them to do. And some amount of time had passed, it was probably a couple of days, went by, and I realized I had completely led them down the wrong path. And they had probably already begun to implement this solution that I had given them, but it was not going to work. So I realized my mistake, and I'm mortified, and I have to pick up the phone and call the customer and say, stop doing what I told you to do, and I need some more time to figure out a different solution. And that was pretty embarrassing, but later that week, I would be meeting my customer contact named John for the first time. We talked on the phone at least once a week about things, and we emailed all the time, but I had never met him in person. And so John was on site at the company, and we were going to be meeting. He's from Philadelphia, and if you know people from the East Coast, they're a little bit more direct than we Midwesterners are. And so we're meeting in person for the first time. We shake hands, and he smiles at me, and he says, "Boy, you really screwed up that last project, didn't you?" Why are you laughing? That was painful. I was really embarrassed. I know John meant well, but I did screw up. Like, I had given them this bad information. I wasted their time, and they had, I'd wasted their time, and I still experience shame when I think about that mistake that I made. And we all have this kind of shame around failure, don't we? And some of it is a lot deeper than just screwing up a small work project. Maybe you got fired from a job. Maybe you screwed up a relationship with someone that you really cared about. Or maybe you set a goal and failed to accomplish it. Or maybe you deeply disappointed someone. And it makes you ask, what does God think about our biggest mistake? About the thing that we're most ashamed of? What does God do with those parts of us that we'd rather people not find out about? Well, turn with me in your Bibles, if you're not already there, to John chapter 18. And since the beginning of this year, we've been in a series in the Gospel of John called Behold Your King. And we began this series on New Year's Day back in chapter 12. And that seems like a long time ago, New Year's Day, but in the story, there's actually less than a week between John 12 and John 18 where we are today. So before we jump in, let's remind ourselves of some important context. Okay, it's the week of Passover in Jerusalem, and the city is crowded with visitors who have come for the celebration. And there's a lot of excitement around Jesus. Jesus has been teaching and performing miracles, right? He raised Lazarus from the dead. And so some people welcomed him to Jerusalem as the Messiah who would liberate Israel. And some people were skeptical, and some people wanted him dead. In the midst of all that excitement, John has just spent the last 5 chapters recording an intimate conversation between Jesus and his disciples, right? He washed their feet. He predicted that one of them would betray him. He told them that he's about to go away and that he's going to send the Holy Spirit to come and help them. And he prayed for them. That was last week in chapter 17. And now in chapter 18, Jesus and the disciples are on the move again. Look at verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, where he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with the disciples. And so Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" So Jesus and the disciples, they leave the city and they head east into a garden where Jesus evidently met with his disciples. And apparently they were there often enough that Judas knew that they would be there on this night. And Judas shows up with these soldiers, and apparently it's a sizable group. The Greek seems to indicate that this is a large group of soldiers. They outnumber the disciples, and they're armed. And yet Jesus is portrayed as completely in control of the situation. Right? He knew Judas would betray him. We were told that back in chapter 13. So Jesus is not surprised. And now he steps forward and he asks the armed crowd, "Who are you looking for?" And then one of my favorite scenes in the entire Bible takes place. Verse 5. They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, was standing there with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Now in Greek, Jesus says just 2 words here. Ego eimi, I am. The word he, it's implied, and in our translations, they insert it so that the sentence makes sense in English. But in Greek, just two words, I am. And when he says those two words, it knocks this crowd of armed soldiers to the ground. When the Old Testament was translated into Greek, the divine name Yahweh was translated as ego eimi, I am. And so when Jesus steps forward and identifies himself to this crowd of soldiers, his words have a double meaning. He's saying, yeah, I'm the guy you're looking for. And also, I am the I am. And the soldiers, they hit the ground. Not in worship, right? They're still going to arrest Jesus in just a minute. But it's out of compulsion. It's like they can't help it. And it reminds you of the experience Ezekiel had during a vision in which he sees the heavenly throne room. Right? He describes these incredible angelic beings. This is in Ezekiel chapter 1. He's overwhelmed by the sights and sounds. And he tries to describe this figure that he sees seated on the throne. But it's like his words are inadequate. And finally he says, such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, the I am. And when I saw it, I fell on my face. I love that sentence. He sees the likeness of the glory of the Lord, the I am, and it knocks him on the ground. And the same thing will happen to John in the book of Revelation. He says this, then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. And his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword. And his face was like the sun shining in full strength. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. This encounter with God, it knocks Ezekiel and John down on the ground. And here the same thing happens in John 18 to these soldiers when Jesus reveals his identity to them. And you'd think it would cause them to think twice about arresting Jesus. But in just a moment, they're going to recover and they're going to arrest him anyway, which I think is pretty interesting. Sometimes I hear people say to me, it would just be so much easier to trust God if he would reveal himself to me like he did to people in the Bible. And I just don't think that's true. These guys arrest Jesus despite this moment of revelation. In their case, sight does not lead to faith. Right? God can literally knock us off our feet, and we can still find reasons to deny him. Verse 7. So he asked them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. He answered, I told you that I am. So if you seek me, let these men go. This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. Of those whom you gave me, I have not lost one. Here we see Jesus protecting his disciples. He says, if you're just looking for me, then let my disciples go. Once again, it's Jesus who's in control of the situation. He's going to take care of his disciples. But then Peter makes his first mistake of the night. Instead of letting Jesus protect him, he decides he's going to protect Jesus. Verse 10. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? And you kind of can't blame Peter here. Right? If Jesus can turn water into wine, if Jesus can heal diseases, if he can raise the dead and knock over a crowd of soldiers with a couple of words, then this fight should be no contest. Peter told Jesus in chapter 13 that he would lay down his life for him, and now he's ready to demonstrate his loyalty. But Jesus, who's still in control of the situation, tells Peter to put his sword away. That's not how this is going to go down, Peter. Verse 12, so the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And I think this moment is incredibly disorienting to Peter. Imagine thinking you were helping Jesus fight the bad guys, And then Jesus rebukes you and gives himself over to the bad guys. And Jesus allows himself to be arrested. And that breaks Peter's categories about who the Messiah is supposed to be. Despite all the time that Peter has spent with Jesus, he's still expecting a warrior Messiah, and that's not what Jesus gives him. And so the soldiers arrest Jesus, and they take him back to the city. Verse 13. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. And we actually know quite a bit about this guy Annas, and a little bit about Caiaphas as well from non-biblical sources. Annas had been high priest in Jerusalem for about 10 years before he was deposed by a Roman governor in the year 15. But we know that he continued to assert a lot of influence in Jerusalem because all 5 of his sons, plus his son-in-law Caiaphas, eventually also served as high priest. So even though at this time he's no longer the high priest, he remained a very powerful figure in Jerusalem. He's even referred to as the high priest in verse 15, probably because people still considered him to be the true high priest. And so the religious leaders, they've brought Jesus to Annas because they want him to investigate this case and tell them what to do. But before John tells us about this trial before Annas, the scene switches. First, he wants to take us back to Peter to see what Peter is up to. What you'll notice throughout this whole passage is that the attention keeps moving back and forth between Jesus and Peter, Jesus and Peter. It's inviting us to compare the two of them. We see Peter's failures and Jesus' success, Jesus' faithfulness and Peter's unfaithfulness. Verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. Now, Peter may be a bit ashamed about being rebuked by Jesus in the garden, but he's still brave enough to follow Jesus into the city. I think he still loves Jesus enough that he wants to know what's going to happen to him. And we don't know for sure who this other disciple is. Okay, there are good arguments for and against it being John, but that doesn't really matter. The important thing is that this disciple, he's in the know. He's known by the priest and his family, and so he's able to get Peter into the courtyard where he can keep track of what's happening to Jesus. But Peter is vulnerable. Maybe it's his Galilean accent that gives him away. Maybe someone saw him with Jesus. But the servant girl who let him into the courtyard presses him, and he wilts. Verse 17. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of the man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now, just a second. Think about this. Just a short time ago, a few verses earlier, Peter was willing to confront a crowd of armed soldiers for Jesus. The disciples were outnumbered, and Peter drew his sword and struck one of the soldiers. And now here in verse 17, he's confronted by a servant girl, and he won't even admit that he's one of Jesus' disciples. So what changed for Peter? Well, I think what changed for Peter is that Jesus isn't meeting his expectations. And Peter was willing to fight with a warrior Messiah, but he's not yet ready to suffer with an arrested Messiah. Jesus isn't meeting his expectations, and so Peter's disoriented, and he stops acting like himself. 3 years of training with Jesus, and then in this pressure cooker of a moment, his brain cramps. Verse 18. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Now this is such a strange detail. Why does John tell us about the fire and Peter warming himself by it? I think for 2 reasons. First, it draws your attention to the only other time in the gospel that a charcoal fire is mentioned, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But second, it gives you this picture of Peter getting comfortable. It's another contrast between Jesus and Peter. While Jesus is inside, getting interrogated by the high priest. Peter is getting cozy around a fire. And now the scene switches back to Jesus. Verse 19. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them, and they know what I said. When he said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? So while Peter's out getting cozy by the fire, Jesus is getting interrogated by the high priest and smacked around by his officer. And what did Jesus say that was so bad? Doesn't it seem like an overreaction to hit him? It seems to be because of what Jesus is insinuating. The high priest wants to know about Jesus' disciples and his teaching, but Jesus says, look, I haven't done anything in secret. My teaching is out in the open, and you can ask anybody about it. Jesus wants Annas to know that he has nothing to hide. But by contrast, Annas has had Jesus arrested at night, and now Jesus is on trial while the rest of Jerusalem is sleeping. Annas is the one who's operating in secret. Jesus is saying, I taught during the day, and you arrested me at night. I preached in the open, and you're trying me in secret. And Jesus is accusing Annas of injustice. And accusing the powerful of injustice brings a predictable consequence. He gets hit. And it was no more acceptable in the ancient world than it is today to punch a defendant who's on trial. And so for Jesus, calling out one act of injustice simply leads to another one. And this is really an incredible scene. Just a few verses ago, Jesus toppled a band of soldiers with his words. And this officer may not have known what happened in the garden, but we know that he just punched the I Am. And I don't know about you, but punching God seems like a good way to get an anvil dropped on your head. But instead we see that once again, Jesus is completely in control. Verse 23, Jesus answered him, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Jesus does not retaliate. He simply points out again that he is the one who's in the right. Just imagine how Jesus could have responded here. Imagine how you would have responded. We live in a culture that says when you get hit, you hit back twice is hard. We even celebrate it, right? We say, wow, you really owned that guy. Good work. And I think Christians are just as susceptible to this kind of mentality as anyone else. And too often we're even participants in it. But that's not Jesus. Jesus says when you get hit, you turn the other cheek. And here he practices what he preached. And Jesus could have eviscerated this guy. But instead, his eyes are fixed on the cross, which is where he knew he was headed all along. It's where he had to go for people like you and me and for Peter. Verse 24. Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. So as Jesus is sent on to the next stage of his trial, Peter continues to warm himself by the fire. And he's confronted twice more about his relationship to Jesus. Aren't you one of his disciples? Didn't I see you in the garden? And twice more, Peter denies Jesus. No, I'm not. That wasn't me in the garden. And at once, a rooster crows. When Peter confidently proclaimed that the previous evening that he would willingly die for Jesus, Jesus told him, no, you're going to deny me 3 times tonight. And I imagine Peter went home that night feeling like a pretty big failure. He tried to protect Jesus in the garden, and got rebuked by him instead. He followed Jesus to his trial, only to deny 3 times that he knew him. And then the rooster crowed to remind him that Jesus knew all along that he was going to fail. His whole world is upside down. Maybe Jesus isn't who I thought he was, and I guess I'm not who I thought I was either. Imagine Peter's shame. Imagine his self-talk. Nice going, Peter, you big dummy. You blew it again. Peter's probably thinking, well, at least no one else has to know this happened, That is, so long as no one writes it down to record for future generations to read about. And that's the thing about this story. Right? Why is this story in our Bibles? Why did all 4 gospel writers feel the need to include it? It seems to me that Peter wanted us to know what happened that night. Because Jesus can take our deepest failure and turn it for his glory. Peter hits rock bottom on this night, but he does not stay there. Jesus won't let him stay there. A few days later, there are reports that Jesus has risen from the dead. And do you remember what Peter did when he heard the news? He ran to the tomb. And when he found it empty, he believed. But he still had work to do with Jesus. And that happens in John 21. For the sake of time, we won't turn there, but John tells us about how Peter and the disciples were out in a boat fishing, and they see Jesus on the shore, and he's got breakfast cooking over a charcoal fire. A charcoal fire. What an interesting detail for John to include. It's the same kind of fire that Peter was warming himself over when he denied Jesus. And it's the only other time in John's gospel when the term is used. It links these 2 stories together. It's a common thing biblical authors will do to make us put 2 stories together and think about how they relate. And then Jesus takes a walk with Peter. And 3 times, Jesus asks Peter if he loved him. And 3 times Peter says, yes, you know that I love you. There were 3 denials at the last charcoal fire, and now 3 professions of love and commitment and faith at this one. And if you turn the page from there and start reading the book of Acts, you'll see that Jesus has big plans for Peter. Peter is going to help lead the early church movement. And church tradition says that eventually he did lay down his life for Jesus. But it seems like an important part of the message that Peter preached, which is why we have the story in all 4 Gospels, is at first he failed. And why did he want us to know about his failure? Because Jesus took Peter's deepest failure and turned it for his glory. And Jesus can do the same for you and for me. Jesus wasn't surprised by Peter's failure. It could not ruin Jesus' plan. Throughout this passage, Jesus is never not in control. If your world seems upside down because you failed, remember that Jesus is still in control. And maybe you're feeling the sting of failure. Maybe Jesus isn't meeting your expectations. Or maybe you're finding out that you're not who you thought you were or who you wanted to be. Jesus isn't surprised. And he invites you to do the same thing as Peter. Run to the empty tomb. Run to Jesus. Run to the one who took your greatest failure, your sin, your shame, and nailed it to the cross. To Jesus, who invites you back with open arms. He wants us to bring our failure, our shame to him. And maybe it doesn't feel safe to come to Jesus with that. Maybe you can't possibly imagine how it can be turned to glory, right? Our impulse is always to hide it. In C.S. Lewis' brilliant fictional book, The Great Divorce, he tells us not to hide our shame, but to drink it. This is what one of the characters says. He says, "Do you remember on earth there were things too hot to touch with your finger, but you could drink them all right? Shame is like that. If you will accept it, if you will drink the cup to the bottom, you will find it very nourishing. But try to do anything else with it, and it scalds." We've all failed. We all have shame that we're dealing with. And rather than deny it or stuff it or hide it, let's drink it. and let's run to Jesus. Jesus already knows your failure, and he's just waiting for you to come so that he can turn it for his glory. We don't know how he will do it, but Peter's story gives us faith that he can and he will. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you that you took the cup the Father gave you and you drank it to the bottom. Thank you for going to the cross for us, for taking our failure and our shame and for receiving us with open arms. And I want to pray specifically for those who are feeling the sting of failure this morning. For those who are sitting before you today thinking they're just a big screw up. God, would you remind us that nothing can separate us from the love of Christ? Remind us that you drank the cup of God's wrath so that they don't have to. And remind us that you can take our shame